I think we're in our seventh or eighth day of the invasion, the war against Iran. I'd like to put this in context. Not too long ago, this administration started dropping missiles, guided missiles, on small boats, alleging that we were killing narcotics traffickers characterized by the administration as narco-terrorists. And the allegation is that these people posed a clear and present and imminent threat to the United States. Most experts believe that's doubtful. Most experts believe that even if some or most of these boats were transporting drugs, they were meant for nearby islands or perhaps ultimately for Europe, and they weren't carrying fentanyl. They were carrying, when they were carrying drugs at all, marijuana, cocaine, much less associated with death in America. But when people questioned the wisdom or legality of what we were doing, we, the American people, through our military, the question was thrown back, are you really going to defend people who engaged in the illegal drug trade? And no question about it, it's a ruthless business, but not everybody involved in it is a ruthless person. Sometimes they are fishermen who are barely getting by, trying to make a little bit of extra money for the welfare of their families. A mistake, but not a death penalty mistake. Moving on. American cities, certain American cities, became flooded with immigration agencies. And they invaded in small armies and began to abuse people. Not only the quote-unquote worst of the worst, but many decent of our friends and neighbors who, yes, had entered the country illegally, but had become part of the fabric of the country. And they were dealt with as ruthlessly as the worst of the worst. And it's not just the people who had entered the country illegally that were being abused. Foreign guests were abused, foreign journalists, domestic journalists, and American citizens. All of this culminated in the massive invasion of Minnesota and the murder of Renee Good and Alex Pretty. And the administration tried to say the same thing they had said about the alleged drug boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific. They accused the people they had murdered of being domestic terrorists. How can you defend these people? But America wasn't having it, and the administration backed off. Kudos to the heroism of the people of Minnesota. Internationally, we swept into Venezuela, into Caracas, and plucked the president of Venezuela from his palace and his wife and transported them to Manhattan, where they're now facing charges of drug trafficking. And whenever anybody tried to criticize that operation, which was militarily brilliant, the answer was always, are you really going to defend? Are you really going to stand up for this terrible person? And he was an execrable ruler. I think even in Venezuela, where he ignored the results of the democratic elections and stayed in power by brute force, even in Venezuela, I doubt that he is much missed. But America also reached out and threatened to invade Greenland, which is associated with a NATO ally, one of our best and bravest friends, the nation of Denmark. And Americans weren't having it. And the administration backed off. Now, we've invaded Iran. Same drill. It's costly in lives and in treasure. But the administration can say, are you really sorry that we've decapitated these terrible, violent, bloody rulers? Where is this going? I've heard the administration say that Cuba may be next. And this is what I'm afraid of for America. I'm afraid that an attitude that this nation is one that gets what it wants by violence will be baked into our identity. Or at the very least, the violence, the military operations will become part of the background noise of our lives. And one day, this administration or some administration may renew the idea of invading a friendly country like Denmark, like Canada, like Mexico. And because getting what we want by violence is so baked into our identity, or at the very least becomes simply a background noise that we tune out, that we can see that headline, we can see the images online, shrug, and move on to sports. I fear for our country if we become a country that identifies with getting what we want by violence. It goes against what we learn from the earliest age. So many children, when they attend Sunday school, hear the story of the soldiers coming into Gethsemane to arrest Jesus, to take him off to be crucified. And Peter wakes up, comes out of his stupor, pulls out a sword and cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. And Jesus says, "Stop. He who lives by the sword dies by the sword." Don't we believe that? Doesn't history teach us that? That a nation that trusts in its power, in its force, sooner or later gets swept away. In the middle of World War II, Nazi Germany was considered by many, especially in occupied countries, to be the inevitable victor of the struggle that was going on. And although it took a few years, and it took blood and heroes and the expenditure of great wealth, one day Nazi Germany, in not too long, was swept away. Hitler was dead, and that government was consigned to the dustbin of history. I don't want America to suffer that fate. How do we stop it? We recognize that, yes, it's a political problem, but more to the point, it's a spiritual problem. And in order not to become acclimated to the ways of violence, to the ways of the world, to the ways of dominance, we need to stay in constant contact with that great force for peace, the great power that created the universe and teaches us to live with one another in harmony by prayer, by meditation, by reading, by conversation, by worship. I think people know how to do that. But if we're rusty in our habits, and I know that I need to step up my spiritual game, If we're rusty in our habits, there are books by Dallas Willard about spiritual practices, the spiritual disciplines. Richard Foster. There's a good book by, I think it's Douglas Postema, called Space for God, that's meant to be read by groups to discuss a chapter at a time, week by week. It's what may help us pull out of this death spiral that I fear we are entering. I don't have all the answers. I could be very wrong. I like what Marilyn Robinson wrote. Human beings are biased toward error. And I am a human being. But I think of the Beatitudes in Matthew, one of which says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." What better thing to be called? So whatever your faith tradition, even if you disagree with me about what I've said, what's the harm of spending more time and spending more quality time with your Creator? What good might come of that? What harm could possibly come of that? I don't know what God has in store for me. I don't know what God has in store for you. But it seems to be a path worth taking. And it seems inevitably that it must be a path toward good and away from evil. What do you think?